So welcome to the first webinar of the day. I'd like to welcome Steve Pickston, who's our first guest speaker. So Steve is the Head of Fire Risk Management for the Science and Technology Facilities Council and also an IOSH Fire Risk Management Committee member. Steve will be talking today about personal emergency evacuation plans, or PEEPs for short. I'll tell you a little bit about Steve before we hand over. If you do have questions as we go along, there is a Q&A box at the very bottom of the screen. The chat function is for you to have discussions amongst yourselves, but if you want to pose a question, please make sure it's in the Q&A section. That way I can pick it up and ensure that it's answered promptly. There'll be time at the end to answer all of the questions. So a little bit about Steve. Steve has done risk management, has been a risk management surveyor for an insurance company and has served for 22 years in the RAF as a firefighter and fire safety specialist. Highly skilled with experience in incident command, emergency planning and multi-agency response to incidents involving dangerous substances, and has completed many overseas operational tours in a number of roles. So Steve will be covering some topics such as moral, financial and legal requirements, why PEEPs are needed, facilities, equipment and training. So I'll hand over to you, Steve, if that's okay.
Sure, thank you very much. And thanks for having me. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation. And just as a way of an introduction, in regards to PEEPs, PEEPs I'm quite passionate about. Because I think I've got some members of family who are vulnerable in regards to disabilities, and one particular family member really struggled with their employer in regards to their ability to evacuate the building in an emergency once, and it gives me a real focus on this area amongst a raft of other things that I look after in my role. So PEEPs is something I am quite passionate about, and trying to improve this. It's not always easy. A lot of older stock of buildings, certainly in my experience, it's very difficult to have the right level of facilities that we'd expect in a more modern building. But we'll talk a little bit around that today as well. So yeah, I've been with the Science and Technology Facilities Council now for close to 2 years. We've got a real range of buildings here. We've got some really highly advanced brand new buildings that have got a full range of disabled refuges, communication devices, visual alarms, and all the things that you'd expect in a modern building. And then I've got some really old stock buildings that are ex-Air Force buildings for when this site was an old Air Force base back in the sort of 50s and 60s. So I've got a real varied stock of buildings, so hopefully I can bring that to life for you today in this presentation. But one of the things I want to just sort of stipulate is up front that for PEEPs in the workplace, there's a common myth that I want to dispel, that our responsibility is to get people who have got an inability to evacuate themselves into a disabled refuge, and we leave them there. The fire and rescue service will come around the corner and pick up the pieces, but that is just simply not the case. And there's legal duties placed on responsible persons to make sure that we do deal with this, and we get people out of the building ourselves, and we don't rely on the fire and rescue service. So the fire and rescue service is definitely not to be relied upon in all cases. There is a couple of exceptions to that. They're obviously expected to maybe provide a bit more support in maybe the care sector, in hospitals, certainly where you might have a large number of persons to move. But yeah, in the main, the fire and rescue service will expect people to have evacuated the building as far as reasonably practicable. So what we're going to cover, we're going to just have a quick look at the moral, financial, legal requirements, why PEEPs are needed. Talk a little bit about impairments, because I think as well, one of the other things that I've noted throughout my career is there's a lot of tie to physical disabilities, and of course that is a major blocker for people leaving a building. but there's a whole range of other conditions and impairments that may require people to have assistance or reasonable adjustments made. So we'll cover some of those. A little bit about collaboration and support, and the facilities and equipment that we potentially got on site or haven't in some cases, and what we can do about that, and some of the considerations and training requirements. Touch on PEEPs, which is more for public spaces, and essentially more of a generic evacuation plans. And then I'm going to touch on residential PEEPs, and I'll be interested to understand how many people in the group today listening are from a residential setting. There's still a lot of work to do in this space. Obviously, one of the things that the tragedy at Grenfell brought to light was we didn't necessarily have a way to get immobile people and people with impairments out of residential buildings, more high-rise buildings. There has been some dialogue, but there's the regulations and the law around it are yet to come, and the guidance. But there is some movement on this, and I'll share the up-to-date document with you at the end of the presentation. So the moral, legal, and financial landscape around this subject. So a survey that was done in 21-22, which is the most recent that I can find on the internet, done by the government, suggested that there was around about 16 million people with impairments and disabilities in the UK. And in the working environment, that figure sits at around between 10.5 to 11 million people of those disabled who are of working age. Not all of them might be working, I must add. But that gives us an idea that quite a few people out of the population do have issues that we need to help them with in terms of in this space around PEEPs. We've got some clear financial incentives. Obviously, the things that we think about a lot of the time in regards to PEEPs and compliance tends to be around the sort of what can happen if it all goes wrong. So, criminal breaches of duties, civil claims, and whatnot. That is all relevant. But it's the indirect impact of not having PEEPs in place and people not being productive. It's hard to recruit people if you've not got inclusive policies within your workplaces. And if people are off work, obviously overtime, loss of production, sick pay. So there's a number of financial implications of not having PEEPs in place. From a legal standpoint, there are criminal ramifications in regards to the Equalities Act and the Fire Safety Order, which are the two key bits of legislation that are centered around the sort of the PEEPs space. And also you've got civil claims for persons who feel that they've been discriminated against, and you could get employment tribunals. And if somebody can't evacuate the building in a safe manner, you could get potential injury claims from not having the right level of procedures in place. So those legal ramifications are there, and we'll talk a little bit around some of the key legislation in a moment. And for me, morally, it is just the right thing to do. We live in an age where we shouldn't be discriminating against people. We should give everybody similar opportunities. And the right thing to do is make sure that everybody can get out of the building in an emergency. And I often say to people when I get any challenge on any implementation of PEEPs and people who potentially suggest it's too difficult, I often say, put yourself in the position of the person who is sat there when the fire alarm's going off and they can't get out of the building on their own. And that really tends to hammer the point home that you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the person who's got the problems in terms of evacuation. So they're just some of the financial, legal, and moral implications of not getting the PEEPs correct. So the key legislation and guidance. You'll potentially all be familiar with DDA. That left us a little while back. So in 2010, the Equalities Act came in. And I'm not going to go through the Equalities Act in detail, but a couple of the key sort of articles to pull out of that are some regulations are sort of like Regulation 20, which centres around reasonable adjustments to be made for people who need assistance. So if we can't manage a situation out, the reasonable adjustments may need to be made in terms of creating disabled refuges, putting in voice communication systems, and things like that. So the Equalities Act covers certain aspects like that. The regulatory reform order, there isn't any direct correlation with PEEPs itself, but it does make it quite clear that under Article 15, procedures for serious and imminent danger, we need to be able to make sure that we can get everybody out of the building as far as reasonably practicable. And that includes the evacuation of relevant persons and persons with additional needs. So the regulatory reform order is probably one of the key ones from a fire perspective. Of course, PEEPs doesn't just cover fire. It tends to fall into the fire sort of hands in an organisation or general health and safety. But there's other reasons we might want to evacuate a building in a swift manner where a PEEP will be activated, such as for my facilities, we might have a gas leak. We might have some sort of oxygen depletion alarm. I'll get the words out. There might be some sort of terrorist threat where we need to evacuate the building or move people in a building. So there's a whole range of reasons why you'd need a PEEP. It's not just for fire, but fire tends to be where it's linked into closely. But there is other legislation and regulations out there that probably need this to be looked at. It's a little bit embarrassing in a sense, pointing you towards this document, because it's not been properly updated for a long time. I think 2007 is when the guide that on the right hand side of the page there come out. It has been updated on the web page recently, but not really to the extent that I'd expect. But there's some really, really good practical guidance in that document there. So if you've not seen it, it's free to download. And when I send the slides out for this presentation, sorry, go back. When we send the slides out, there is a link on there that takes you straight to this document that online. And it covers all of the different impairments and different questions you might want to ask when you're putting your PEEP together. And there's a couple of templates in there as well. Some of the language in there, so it still talks about the DDA 1996 legislation rather than the Equalities Act. So that's all out of date, but actually the guidance within the document you can still use in a practical manner. So please have a look at that if you are looking to develop PEEPs. So essentially, why would a PEEP be needed? So in an emergency, especially when it comes to a fire breaking out, because that generally needs a fair amount of urgency, we need a safe evacuation of all occupants, and that should be a priority for any organisation, people first. And a PEEP is needed when a relevant person requires additional support during an evacuation. So who is a relevant person? Relevant person in fire safety terms is somebody who is legally on the premises. We need to make sure that we've got adequate facilities in place for people. We'll talk a little bit about GEEPs in a little while, which covers more public places where you can't have a specific plan for somebody. A PEEP is obviously a personal emergency evacuation plan, and it's very much centered around that person and that individual's needs. Whereas a GEEP is more generic, and we've got PEEPs and GEEPs in place in my organisation to cover off visitors and where we've got maybe large events going on. But essentially, it's just that we've had a look at it. We've identified that there's a person with additional needs to get out of a building, and we need to give them some support and put some procedures in place. So who might need a PEEP? So again, I just reiterate that this is generally the common finding for me in this space, that people just attribute this to physical disabilities. Tends to be a lot of around wheelchair users and people with limited mobility. But obviously there's a range of different reasons why people might not be able to get out of a building in a timely manner. So if you think about people with visual disability, they can't see their way out. So they're going to hear the fire alarm, but they can't see what's going on. We might need to obviously get people out in a rush and put some assistance in place for those who can't see their way and how to get out. Hearing, clearly the opposite there. So this is why a lot of places now seem to have audio visual alarms. So when the fire alarms are going off, there's a strobe that's in there. and that strobe will flash and obviously warn somebody that there's something going on. Cognitive, we've got a couple of people that work on my campus who are quite happy for me to discuss this. I'm not going to name any specifics clearly, but the autistic people tend to not like a lot of noise, or certainly two people that I'm dealing with. So they wear noise cancelling headphones in the workplace. So that helps with the sort of day-to-day noise that's going on and around them. They do tend to react worse when the fire alarms go off. So that it's really important they keep the headphones on during an event. But obviously we need to communicate with people and make sure that they're aware that something's going on and we can get them out of the building. And also something else to just raise, permanent impairments seem to be covered in most cases, but for me, temporary ones. We had an individual who broke his leg playing football, come back to work on crutches, and we put a PEEP in place just to cover the individual. And we reviewed that as his recovery moved along. So when he came off crutches, he was still struggling with stairs, and he was still quite slow. So we kept the PEEP in place. But then when obviously the full mobility came in, we removed the PEEP at that point because he was able to evacuate the building himself. Pregnancy. Again, pregnancy is one of those. I think it's generally the later stages of pregnancy where you might need a PEEP. But if an employee does identify that they are pregnant, then obviously we want to be reviewing that from sort of the time when individuals start showing, and then obviously they might not need any assistance or any special measures in place at 5 months, for instance, but at 8 months when they're just about to go into maternity leave, they may be really sort of limited in mobility, and it all depends on the individual again, and we'll touch on that in a moment in terms of how this is approached from the individual being key to this. But there's a number of other temporary situations that may need a PEEP to be put in place. So it's just the permanent aspect and the temporary aspect as well to consider. So the next slide is around who is involved when we're developing a PEEP. A PEEP, I'll be honest, in some people's eyes is a box ticking exercise. They feel they need to put a PEEP in place to make sure they're complying with any policies and legislation. I'm trying to get rid of that approach to this in terms of make sure that people are aware that the individual is absolutely key to this PEEP. It's not about just filling out a form and hoping it all goes right if we need to evacuate somebody. That the individual should be at the centre of the PEEP, and everything that's done with it, they need to be included in it. I did pick up a couple of PEEPs in a previous role that the individual hadn't even seen, and the measures that were put in place were what were deemed by the management of the organisation as being appropriate, and that the individual hadn't even seen the PEEP. Not in my organisation, but one I was looking at in another job. But it just shows you that does happen. So what I tend to do, my policy on PEEPs is I will sit down with the individual, and I'll go through a set of questions with the individual. Then I'll bring in the line manager after that, and then we'll have a group discussion about what we need to do, what measures we need to put in place, any extra things that we need to consider, or any systems that we need to update and put in place as well. So, and then once we've got a completed PEEP, that will go to the individual first to make sure they are happy with it, because they're the most important person in this process. And then we'll get the line managers to sign off on it. And also, obviously, collaboration with other people who need to be involved in activating the PEEP as well. Got to be reasonably careful with data protection, but in my experience, most people are quite happy for the key information to be shared with other people who are going to enact that PEEP as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. So who's the best person to assist? So if somebody is in their office working away and they need to get out of the building, what we don't need is somebody that's halfway across the campus who's going to come in and move that person out the way into a safe space, or particularly straight out the building. And really what we don't want is the fire wardens being tied up with this role as well, because the fire warden is going to be doing the sweep of the building and doing their fire warden duties. Very difficult to help a person with mobility issues, as an example, as well as doing a sweep of the building effectively. So for me, the best thing we can do is get use a buddy system. So we've got a particular case of this where we had security who were the backdrop, and they were going to turn up and help this person out of the building, but that'd probably take about 2 minutes. But we've changed that now. We retrained about 5 or 6 colleagues of the person who needs support in their office space and on their floor plate, so that at any one time, at least 1 or 2 people will generally be around to help that person to the refuge, and then into an evac chair and down the stairs. It took a little bit of training and a little bit of work to get that in place, but it's a much more robust system now where we can get somebody out of the building quickly and efficiently. And then when security turn up to investigate the alarm, they're not now trying to think, what do I do first? Do I go and help the individual, or do I do my job and check what the alarm's actually gone off for? So it's just making sure that we don't ask too much of one person or 2 people in this kind of situation. So definitely the way forward is training people up to do this. So adequate facilities and equipment. So a big part of this is looking at the fabric of the building. I do a lot in the fire engineering space. So when we've got an old building, for instance, the fabric of the building might not actually support the use and the concept of a disabled refuge. A disabled refuge is generally a place that's got a 1-hour fire compartment. So if anything is happening in that building, nothing should happen in that disabled refuge space for at least an hour, which gives us time to move the person on and down the stairs and whatnot. But some older buildings might not actually support that. So the construction might not be 60 minutes fire resistant. There might not be space in the actual staircases. So luckily here on my site, I've got a number of buildings where we've got quite big stairwells. So we've got space to actually have a refuge area and some equipment. In other buildings, like the one I'm sat in now, my office building, it's quite small and tight. So the stairwells don't have enough space to actually put somebody into and have, people sort of trying to get around them. So it very much depends on the fabric of the building in terms of refuges. But if you're obviously in a building that's been built in the sort of 2000s upwards, a lot of buildings tend to have disabled refuges built in into the building. But what I'd just say is even on the side of caution, if you've got an older building, don't just assume you can turn your stairwell into a disabled refuge, because the fabric of the building needs to be assessed against that. So we've got different evacuation chairs and mats. So evacuation chairs, again, we're probably focusing heavily here on mobility, but that tends to be one of the most challenging spaces to get people downstairs and upstairs potentially. So there's a number of different evacuation chairs and drag mats that are on the market. We use evac chair because they're, for me, the original, and they've got really good products and a really good range of products, and their training is excellent as well. I'm not a spokesperson, so there are other manufacturers, but they're the people that I go to. And if you're ever looking to introduce evac chairs to any of your premises, I suggest going to some of the trade fairs, the health and safety trade fairs, health, safety, wellbeing, the one at Birmingham NEC, where these sort of companies do sort of set up demos, and they bring all of their chairs out, and you can see which products that they've got to offer. So we've got chairs on this site that go just the general ones. The common ones that we use are the ones that just go downstairs. We've got some that go upstairs where you need to go up to get out of the building. They're powered. we've also got a one that's especially for a spiral staircase, which we've got up on one of our other sites. The drag mats can be used as well, but again, I think drag mats are more for where you've got lots of people to get down quite quickly. And obviously, what you've got to weigh up is the individual's needs. So if we've got somebody with chronic back pain, we don't really want to be dragging them downstairs on a mat. We want to be putting them in a chair so it's nice and smooth, the movement. So things like that just need to be considered as part of your questioning when you're talking about putting the PEEP together. And we'll cover that in a bit more detail in a moment, what things we want to be getting out of people. So warning devices. So again, audio-visual warning devices, generally quite common now. We've put in our fire design standard for any new buildings or major refurbs that all of our detectors will be all of our sounders will be sounder strobes, so that we've got a way of getting everybody out the building, regardless of the situation. You've got EVCs, the voice communication systems, as you can see in the bottom right there. And again, just things to consider, really. We had a new building finished not too long ago, where there was sounders in the stair cores where these disabled refuges were, and you couldn't hear yourself think when they were going off. So we've now redesigned the system, because what we did on an evac drill, we found that the security at the bottom of the corridor, on the ground floor near the panel, they couldn't hear the alarm going off, and somebody on the third floor was ringing the EVC to say, I'm stuck up here, I can't get out. So what we did there was we disabled the sounders in the stair cores themselves, so that people could actually hear themselves think. We still had the strobe lights, and you could still kind of hear in the background from the adjacent corridors that there was a fire alarm event going on. But it just meant that the refuges worked well, and people could hear each other on these EVC systems. Yeah, so that's just some considerations when you're looking at facilities and equipment. Julie, do you want me to take some of these questions now, or do you want me to catch them all at the end?
It's entirely up to you. Normally we would do it at the end, but it's up to you whether you cover some of them off in the presentation or not further down the line.
Okay.
I've got notes on them, so if you want to continue, we can pick it up at the end.
Yeah, I will. I'll continue. There's only a few, so I'll continue.
No
We will
worries.
catch them at the end, just to reassure everyone.
A reminder to everybody to pop the questions in the Q&A section rather than the chat, so that we can mark them off and ensure that they're answered.
Okay, no problem. Right. So what are the considerations when developing PEEPs? This is where the document I showed you before, the guidance document, really comes into its own, because there's a lot of questions in there. Some of them I think maybe not so relevant, but there's more than enough questions in there to keep you on track. But these are just some of the key considerations that we're going to cover in the next few slides. So look at the detail. Like I said before, the individual is key to this. So look at the details of the individual, get an overview of the impairment and what are the likely barriers to safe evacuation. So is it hearing the alarm? Is it seeing the alarm? Is it movement through the building, in regards to, having to get through multiple layers of fire doors to get to the refuge and then get them down the stairs? So what are the likely barriers to getting that person outside the building to the evacuation point? And you're basically building a picture from their desk all the way out to the evacuation point, and just going through that process in a logical manner. And again, just keeping the details of the individual as the key factors in that. What's the evacuation strategy? What are the primary and alternate routes for the person? So if the route that they would ordinarily take to get them out of the building is blocked, what's the alternate routes? So again, looking at the 2 or 3 different ways that they can get to the evacuation point, depending on where a potential incident or fire is. What's the method of evacuation? What are there disabled refuges, and who's going to assist? Who's going to assist again is key, to make sure that covered things like if the individual comes in the morning and they're first in and there's nobody in with them for an hour or so, what happens in that gap if anything was to happen, if they did need assistance. So just cover things off as best as you can. That might just be a case of saying, actually, we need somebody in with that person at all times, depending on the situation. But it allows you to understand where these gaps are going to be in the working day. How we're going to communicate, notification of the alarm, communication during the evacuation. So all of that communication between the various people. So think about your fire wardens. They're not necessarily, as we discussed before, going to be involved in getting the person out of the building, but they need to know what's going on. So if they see a few stragglers, because they're trying to obviously clear people out of a building, they know that they're involved in evacuating the person who needs help. If you've got any security teams or any alarm investigation teams who come around to investigate fire alarms, making sure that they're aware of what's going on and that there's still people in the building, but we're planning to get them out. So good communication during an incident is quite hard because there's a lot going on. You've got alarms going off. Everyone's running around like a bit of a headless chicken doing what they're supposed to be doing. So it's really important just to preempt this and get ahead of it. So if, like for my instance here, if security in this building, they know that in the event of a fire alarm, we've got a lady on the middle floor who has got a PEEP. When they arrive, they'll just do their business unless we tell them we need some assistance. And they'll understand that there's maybe 2 or 3 people trying to get that person out of the building. So that explains why there's still somebody in the building after a couple of minutes. What equipment might be needed to support? So looking at things like disabled refuges, are they adequate? Is the fire protection adequate? Have we got the systems we need? What we can't do is wheel people into an area. And again, I'm talking more mobility issues because they can't get themselves out generally without assistance. But what we're talking about there is we can't just pop them into a refuge and leave them there without knowing what's going on. So if the EVC, the voice communication system, is there, make sure you've got somebody on the other end of it who is talking to that person. Generally, it's from the lobby or a central monitored area, but all of our EVCs now go through to our security desk. So if everyone's evacuated the building and there's a couple of people left in a refuge, there is somebody there on the end of the phone to talk to them. Because again, put yourself in the position of that individual who's stuck and can't move, and they being completely unaware of what's going on around them. So that's really important. Make sure that those EVC systems, voice communication systems, are tested on a regular basis. It's quite a common oversight, and make sure that they're sort of serviced on an annual basis. So think about who's going to enact the PEEP. So make sure that everybody's aware when the PEEP goes live, who's involved in it, who needs to know about it. Make sure that that's gone to the right people. I think there was a question on this training. So training for persons involved, use of EVAC chairs, how to use the emergency voice communication systems. Make sure people are fully aware on this on the kit. We'll talk a little bit about training in a moment, so I won't skip ahead. Information to responders. So fire marshals, fire wardens, security, emergency services, when they arrive, if there's still somebody up in a refuge, again, they would expect us to get them down. But if we've got maybe 4 or 5 people, they're not going to sort of like go mad if you turn up but at least tell them what's going on. We've evacuated 3 people. We're just getting the last 2 down now. This is where they are. The fire's over there. It just helps with that situational awareness. And with PEEPs, review them at least annually. And again, it might be a lot more often if circumstances change. So we basically put the onus on the line managers to sit down with the individual on a quarterly basis for just a chat and to check that the PEEP is still okay. And then we do a formal review on an annual basis. And I think that's just really good practice. If it's a temporary PEEP, then generally you'll just have to do it on as you see fit. So for the individual who broke his leg, he had an 8-week window between coming back into work with his plaster cast and crutches and then being completely signed off to walk without any assistance. So we reviewed that PEEP every sort of 2 weeks just to sort of make sure we had the right measures in place. So training, test the PEEP on a regular basis during a fire or other evacuation drills. As I said before, we had one of our newer buildings where we did a fire evacuation drill. We threw an inject in there to say, right, to an individual, go up to the top floor and activate the system. So we'll see what how security react when they arrive. And that highlighted the issue with the sounders and the fact that we couldn't hear people. So there's some really good ways to sort of get out any issues that might not be completely obvious when you're looking at this. So testing the PEEP on a regular basis is really important. Recommend at least annually, but more frequent depending on the complexity of the PEEP. So if you've got somebody with really complex needs and we need to maybe have some powered chairs and the evacuation might be a lot more complex, you might want to bring that to a quarterly or a 6-monthly basis. What I've found is people who are involved in PEEPs generally don't mind getting involved because it gives them some reassurance that things are in place. So training for those using the equipment such as evac chairs, drag mats, etc. This is probably a little bit of a bugbear with me, and it's not just in this space. I think training in a lot of things is generally sits around 3 years. So I know that the evac chair training, their formal training their certification is for 3 years, but we had a 4-month window when we had the training to use the evac chairs, and we were then going to go and cascade that training. In that 4 months over Christmas and into the new year, our skill fade, even though we'd had a 3-hour course on how to use the chairs, was really apparent. So we want the people to get these evac chairs out on a more regular basis. We're definitely going to do annual training, and we're going to potentially do 6-monthly training as well. And then once people get muscle memory, they'll tend to remember how to use the chairs a lot more effectively. I put it back to when I was in the military, in the RAF. For the first 6 years, taking a rifle apart, putting it back together, very, very challenging. At year 22, I could do it with my eyes closed, as you see in the films. So it's that muscle memory, and the same applies to this kind of space as well with evac chairs. Drag mats tend to be a lot easier to use, but again, it needs to be appropriate for the circumstances. So, like I said, training helps with compliance, but more importantly, to give people confidence in the PEEPs. And for the people who the PEEP is about, gives them confidence that people will be able to act in the right manner in the event of an evacuation. So I'm just going to quickly cover GEEPs, because GEEPs are generally a similar principle, but it's on a larger scale. So you tend to see GEEPs in places like hotels, supermarkets, shopping complexes, and this is where you'll have a generic plan. There'll be equipment available for use, communication devices for use, and you'll have maybe a team of people. So in a shopping centre, you might have all the security team trained to enact a GEEP. In the hotel space, it's normally the night porters and the reception staff, potentially, who are trained to evacuate somebody. Very difficult in public places to get a good grip of this, because you don't know who's going to be on the premises at any one time when it's completely open. But for things like events, you could potentially tie that in with your ticketing, for people to let you know if they've got any issues with mobility that they might need assistance for. Hotels, when people check in, again, you'll know that people have got mobility issues, or they might present to you that they've got mobility issues, or any other conditions. So one thing that I didn't mention before, in hotels now, certainly Premier Inn and Travelodge have vibrating pillows. So for people with hearing difficulty, they've got vibrating pillows that they can give out now to any guests who have got any issues with hearing. So that kind of thing is available. And essentially, like I said, they're very generic. So generic evacuation plans tied in with this for hotels. One of the first things I do, sad as I am, is when I get into a hotel room, I check out where my escape routes are to make sure that me and my family can get out in a safe manner. But these are generally posted all over the place to help people understand where these areas are, and then the GEEP would kick in to help get people out. So I want to make sure I've got some decent time for questions at the end. So I'm going to cover this next couple of subjects in quite a succinct manner, because I've give you a link to this document as well, and we'll go through it and the fundamentals. But obviously, following the Grenfell tragedy and the phase 1 inquiry report, it called for some form of PEEPs for residents of high-rise residential flats. The government did very quickly hold a consultation, and they did act very quickly and pushed out some PEEPs guidance for residential premises. But as quickly as they pushed it out, I think there was a furore around how it would be implemented with no law and legislation behind it. So it was retracted very, very quickly, and it hasn't come back out yet. However, they did another consultation following that, and then a study was undertaken and has been ongoing for the foreseeable. And then in the 2nd of September, Ministry of Housing and Communities, local government issued a statement to Parliament announcing that measures will be introduced in 2025. In December 2024, a document named the Outcomes of the Emergency Evacuation Information Sharing Plus consultation and residential PEEPs policy was released. And this is a very, very long document, but what they have done is created this easy read document, which gives you an overview. And we'll just cover this off in the next couple of slides. And the legislation and guidance will be published in due course by the government. That was supposed to be, my understanding was, by April. But we're obviously in May now, entering June, and it's still not out. But I do understand from a couple of sources that this is imminent. But obviously the legislation will take time to go through Parliament on this kind of thing. So as well. So what does this document tell us? It gives us a bit of an idea about some of the common words that are used, and some of the details that they'll need around strategies and whatnot, person-centered fire risk assessments. Ooh. It then goes into a bit of background, and then essentially tells us there's going to be essentially a 5-step residential PEEP process that's put into place, which will help to keep vulnerable residents safe if there's a fire. And a lot of this is tied in with best endeavours, because you'll notice the language that's used, and I'll be very interested to see the language that's used in the upcoming legislation and regulations that follow. But the owner of the manager of the premises must do their best to find out which residents would need help to get out of a fire in the event of a fire. So essentially, this is where good communication with residents is needed. And this is quite challenging in some respects, because you almost need the residents to understand fully what the implications are. And I think people are more aware of that since Grenfell. But there is still barriers in place in certain demographics. But the information must be easy to read for everybody, and the residents can decide if they want to take part in the process or not. So I think that line really puts the emphasis on the individuals to take part in the process. And then the owner or manager of the building where the people live must offer to do a person-centered fire risk assessment for each vulnerable resident. And that will look at the flat itself, where the resident is able to get out of the flat, and what about the shared areas such as the stairwells and whatnot. And as it says there, after looking at these risks, the owner must then put into place some sort of evacuation plan. That could include neighbours, friends, or family. Now, of course, there will be individuals who don't have any family, friends, or neighbours, potentially. So that's where this potentially can be challenging when this does come out. Once the action's in place, the building manager should produce a written residential PEEP statement for what the resident should do in the event of a fire, and they should share that information with the fire and rescue service to help them understand, because this is probably the exception to what I said at the start in regards to fire and rescue services expectation that everybody will have evacuated the building. In this case, it's probably not going to be the case. They probably are more aware that they are going to have to interject and help people out of the building. So giving them that information to enable them to do that is really important. The owner of the manager of the building may only share this information if the resident agrees. Now, of course, it's in the resident's best interest to share this information with the fire service, especially if they have got no help or friends or family around them. But clearly then that is a decision that needs to be recorded and made by the responsible person. And as it says there, if there's a fire and rescue, local fire and rescue service will fight the fire and carry out the evacuation and rescue of vulnerable residents. The owner of the building will, where people live, must check the residential PEEPs regularly and update if required. So again, if you've got residential PEEPs in place, probably a similar approach to normal PEEPs is at least annually check in with the resident to make sure that nothing's changed, any conditions haven't changed and whatnot. This is going to be extremely difficult to implement. I don't envy fire safety managers in charge of residential blocks. Some people are really outgoing and they want to help with putting this kind of thing in place, but experience tells me, and through other people who I've spoken to in this space, not all residents are compliant, and a lot of them don't want to get involved, and some can be quite abusive as well. So it's going to be quite challenging, but this is a kind of a starting platform, I guess, and it's a move in the right direction. How successful it is or not will remain to be seen. But yeah, that's all we've got at the moment. We are now just waiting for the government to actually produce some details, and I'm assuming they're going to provide details on what a person-centered fire risk assessment looks like, what a residential PEEP performer looks like, and how we present this information to the fire and rescue service. But I'm hoping that all comes in due course. So that is an overview, and I'll stop there and say thanks for the opportunity to speak to you, and I'll welcome any questions.
Thanks, Steve. Fantastic, really, really insightful. We've had, I think, 11 questions through, so I'll read those out to you. You may have covered some of them off already because we've had them throughout the duration of the presentation, but it wouldn't hurt to address them and maybe use them as a refresher for things that you've spoken about previously. So if I go to the top of the list, first one was from Emma. Is the legislation outlined applicable to Scotland, or is the legislation slightly different?
So the fire legislation certainly is different. But it's aligned. So the legislation in Scotland. So we got the Fire Scotland Act and the Fire Safety Regulation Scotland. They were both put out at the same time as the Fire Safety Order in 2005, 2006. And the clauses are slightly different, but they are aligned. So the requirements are still there. Just slightly worded differently, but they're the two documents you might just want to check that out with. I've got a site in Scotland in Edinburgh, and I've not found any glaring differences, so I've applied my policy across both England, Wales and Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Would you evacuate ambulant people first and then those who have mobility difficulties, or the other way around?
So the concept of certainly in a more modern building where we've got a disabled refuge, there has to be a set area within that sort of stairwell where you could potentially put somebody while you're evacuating everybody else. So the stair should accommodate everybody who can get out on their own accord first. They're generally the first ones out of the building anyway, because generally people who do have mobility difficulties will take a little bit longer to get to the stairwell in the first instance. What we probably don't want to be doing, depending on the volume of people, is getting evac chairs out, because you don't want people walking around you while you're using an evac chair. So I think, yeah, it's probably more easy and common sense to get ambulant people out first if you can.
Okay. What responsibility do we have as professionals working with someone in their own home?
This is is how far does your duty of care extend? I think is the key question. If you're in the home, the premises with them when something happens, then I can't see an example where you'd leave them in there and just leave on your own accord anyway. You're always going to try and get them out. But I think this is where this residential PEEPs probably extends, because it's centered around high-rise buildings, because that's where most of the problems, obviously, from Grenfell have come out of. But it could be a person who's in a 2 up, 2 down house as well. And I think applying the same principles, but I think It's a tough one to answer that, if I'm honest. And I think I had a similar question when I delivered this in Manchester. I don't think there's anything specific around that, but I think it'd be whoever the organisation that you work for, identifying where your duty of care extends to.
Okay. So is it correct that you need a PEEP for those with functional change and return home to a private residence from hospital with restricted ability to evacuate in the event of a fire?
Sorry.
Yeah, so is it correct? It's probably a little bit tied in with the prior question. Is it correct that you need a PEEP for those with functional change and return home from hospital with restricted ability to evacuate in the event of a fire? So this goes back to having, obviously, in a private residence and somebody coming out and having a PEEP in their own home.
I've not seen that personally. I've not experienced it. No.
Okay.
No, I'm not aware of any sort of legal obligations around that. Whether again, if somebody's leaving hospital and they've got a potentially condition or some sort of ailment that prevents them from evacuating when they get home, I don't know if the NHS have got any extended duty of care to advise people, but I'm not aware of any specific legislation that covers that particular eventuality.
Okie dokie. What would you advise if a person is in a powered wheelchair and would have to be hoisted to move them?
Ooh, so
We're testing you here, aren't we? There's some really good
you are.
questions coming through.
There is. I think it comes down to the general principles in terms of we've got to move that person from where they are, whether they're in a bed or a chair, and they need to be hoisted into some sort of evacuation chair. It's all part of that PEEPs process to look at what steps we need to move them from A to B. And if that needs a hoist or someone to operate the hoist, that'd all be wrapped up in understanding what we need to do to get them from A to B. I guess I don't know if that answers the question or not specifically, but that it's all part of that process. Looking at, it's no different to somebody with a particular problem that they can't maybe sit on a particular evac chair, and we might need to get a powered one that's a lot smoother. That's all about the individual and what the circumstances are.
Yep. Okay. The next question, you have answered this, but it was the guidance on how often you would refresh training on evac equipment. And I know you said it was roughly around 3 years, wasn't it, in terms of the training from manufacturers and suppliers?
That's what I tend to find. I like I said, I think 3 years, and it's the same as first aid. First aid, I used to be a first aid instructor for years. If you train somebody on day one to do CPR, there is no way they're remembering the exact process and everything to do in 2.5 years' time. So that's where the annual refreshers came in. So I apply the same kind of logic to this. And I really advocate getting train the trainer so you can do this training internally. It's a lot more cost effective. And if you've got anybody who's got sort of like basic training qualifications in your workplace, get them on a train the trainer course, and then you can do as much training as you wish to do without any additional cost, apart from the time, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, this one was from an anonymous attendee. Is it national or a legal requirement for trust to have PEEPs equipment?
So the fire safety legislation certainly applies to any organisation. They don't need to be a legal entity. It's anybody who's deemed a responsible person and a person in control of a premises. So if you have people on the premises that would require a PEEP, then the fire safety legislation would need some method, and the PEEP is just generally the accepted method of how we comply with that kind of legislation.
Okay.
If you had another document that does the same thing, not called a PEEP, but you've got to have a way of getting anybody who's legally on your premises out of the building, regardless if you're being a charity, a trust, voluntary organisation, or a workplace.
So does that maybe answer the next question as well? I've had one through. In a residential setting house with 3 tenants with learning disabilities and physical disabilities, only 1 staff member on duty in the night. If you've got to get the first tenant out, can you re-enter the building if you feel it is safe to do so to go and get the next person?
I think again that's all part of your PEEP and looking at some of the stuff we talked about fabric of the building. So you'd have to weigh up the level of fire detection in the building, the level of fire protection to protect the escape routes. So if you could go in straight into an entrance hall that's a protected 30-minute protected space, you could go up to the bedrooms and obviously there's no signs of fire, and you could do that quite quickly. Then great. Um, if obviously there's any signs of fire in the on the ground floor, for instance, and that could be affecting the stability of the floor, then obviously it's a different scenario. So it very much depends on and I think that sort of risk assessment. Uh, if it's that kind of environment, sort of sheltered housing, I guess that would be, or some sort of supported housing. There should be a more in-depth. They don't necessarily need a full fire risk assessment, potentially in certain premises, but there should be a more in-depth look at fire risk and how you're going to get people out anyway. Or if there isn't, I'd recommend one because that then supports your plan to do that and act in that manner.
Yeah, I guess there's no one case the same, is there? Like you say, it's important to do the individual risk assessment dependent on property, clients, resource, etc.
Absolutely.
Okay. Could we use the Tolo stair climber chair for evacuation? I think that's a brand name, isn't it? So I'm sure there's other options out there, but a stair climber for evacuation.
Yeah, so we've got one. We've got a chair that is not a climber, but it's a tracked one, and that goes up and down stairs. I mean, if it's fit for purpose to move somebody from A to B, it doesn't necessarily have to have a label of evac chair. If it's something that moves people in a safe manner, and it helps people get out, then yeah, I'd suggest it should be fine. But again, when you if this is in a workplace, again, a fire risk assessment being done, they should be asking questions around PEEPs and maybe asking to see them, and they'll be looking at the equipment that's used. So all of that kind of helps build you a bit of assurance around what you're doing.
Okay. Just got. I did say there was 10 originally, but we have had a few more in. So I will take these last 4 that are in the Q&A section. Hopefully, we can wrap those up in the next couple of minutes. And then, if anybody does have any additional questions, they can always pose them, and we can feedback following the moving and handling event day. So the next one was we work in schools. We have children with significant movement needs and require hoisting. They are in power chairs and they have dystonia or low tone with degenerative conditions. So lots of body movements with tone or low trunk ability. They cannot safely sit on a standard evac chair. What are the options for these children over 30 kilograms? Do we need 4 people to safely lift them out of their chair onto a mat that is not very comfortable for their spine? How can we say that there are enough staff around to help with this? Also, we are having to keep in mind also what they do when they get down the stairs if they come out of their chair.
Again, I guess this is down to what is the safest mechanism to get the individuals that you're talking about out. Is one chair or one particular way of doing it going to be enough, or do you need 2 or 3 different mechanisms? I would engage. Well, what we do in this circumstance, because I've had a similar, not as complex issue. We got hold of occupational health and got some advice off the doctor as well around equipment that we were going to use. And again, I think it's just reaching out to some of the suppliers to give them the exam question and get them to say, right, well, we've got this product that will meet your requirements. Like I said, there's, for instance, evac chair, I think have got about 6 or 7 different chairs now, all with different sort of functionality. Some have got the seat that you sort of sink into. Some have got like more of a square seat to put people in certain conditions. So I think there's a bit of both there. That some medical advice for the individual, and some dialogue with the maybe a couple of different suppliers on what type of equipment is going to be more suitable for those individuals.
Okay. So are the templates within the fire safety risk assessment suitable for families to use at home, or are there better templates available that you would direct people to use in a domestic setting?
So I would suggest that they're a bit overzealous for using at home, because a blank fire risk assessment in PAS 79, for instance, is 34 pages long, and it goes into everything. But the fire and rescue service do have a lot of advice for fire safety in the home. I'll maybe try and send you some links later to help with that. Some brigades have got better advice than others, but there's a couple of good fire brigades that have got good community fire safety sections of their websites that covers a number of different subjects. And if you reach out to your local fire and rescue service, they can come out and give you a home fire safety visit as well, potentially.
Okay.
So something that you might want to check out if you've got a specific need and you've got potentially the need to create a PEEP, they'll probably come out as a matter of course.
Okay, I think you've probably covered the next one. How would you evacuate a person who needs hoisting from a second floor building? It would be hard to do a transfer onto an evac chair. I guess we go back to what equipment's available and your own risk assessment in short.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
And then finally, in a community setting where we're looking after people in their own homes, does the local authority have any requirement to create a PEEP? We can register them with the local emergency services, but buddy system, etc., wouldn't work here.
Yeah, and this is where I touched on before about the certain examples where the fire and rescue service are probably more inclined and aware that they need to provide assistance, where the buddy system potentially wouldn't work. So again, I think that good liaison with the local fire and rescue service and get some advice and help off them in that circumstance, because they are there to help as well as respond to incidents. The community fire safety teams are a lot better than they used to be.
Fabulous. Okay, we will end it there. Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate your time. If there are any